Okay, hello. So my name's Sue O'Brien and I'm the Strategic Lead for South Yorkshire Futures at Sheffield University. And I want to welcome you to what is our first ever Sheffield University Institute of Education and South Yorkshire Futures virtual conference. But before I hand over to our wonderful range of speakers, and you've all seen the range of speakers that we have, I just want to give you a bit of background as to why we're here today from our perspective here at Hallam. As an Institute of Education, we've long since realised the importance of supporting our trainee teachers to understand at a deeper level the impact of trauma and adverse childhood experiences on children and young people and how this affects their ability to thrive. We have integrated this into our initial teacher training education for all our trainees, and that's regardless of their subject or their age phase. So every trainee from early years through to post-16 receives training in this now. But then since the inception of the South Yorkshire Future programme, we've taken the opportunity to pursue our vision alongside our partners to support the development of a trauma-informed school, college and early years workforce across the region. And that is work in progress, and I know many of you in the audience have been involved in those discussions, including the actual conference that we held back in early March, which of course seems a lifetime ago because we all met in one room, and I think we actually did a bit of handshaking and hugging at that time as well. But of course, what the current situation has done is suddenly bring the importance of this trauma-informed work into blindingly sharp focus. And we all recognise at a personal level that this situation that we're in has impacted on us regardless of our age, our background, or our circumstances, and in an incalculable number of ways. And there's no doubt will continue to impact for months and possibly years to come, long after the current restrictions on our lives have left us. Of course, for us in education, it's brought into focus, possibly more than any event has ever really done before, the needs of the most vulnerable children and young people in our society. And we all work with children and young people because we care, because we want to make a difference. And never, certainly in my lifetime, has that drive been more provoked than at this current time. We know that some of our children and people are currently experiencing, what they are currently experiencing will stay with them forever. For example, the effects on their own and their families' mental health, the effects of increasing poverty, the bereavement that will be felt far and wide will all leave scars, and it will be up to us, the schools, the earlier settings, colleges and wider communities to be there to provide the support, the compassion and the relationships that those children and young people will need in order to recover. You might have seen the National Youth Agency have just published a report. It's called the Out of Sight Vulnerable Children and Vulnerable Young People report, and they highlight three main areas of concern. The increased mental health problems, both for the children, for the young people and their families. Those children missing from education, of course, with schools only partially open and youth centres closed, as few as 5% of young people are currently engaged in school. And even when schools reopen, there are 700,000 young people consistently absent or not in education, employment or training. And then, of course, there's the at-risk at home concern. Children that are at risk from the so-called toxic trio of addiction, mental health and domestic abuse. But despite this increase that we're all very aware of, the child protection referrals have plummeted by up to 50% in some areas. So schools and wider organisations have, without exception or hesitation, stepped up to this challenge of trying to meet some of these needs in the most humbling and yet innovating and inspiring ways. These organisations and settings, the people in them, you have always had these young people's needs at your heart, but never has a call to action been more immediately felt or needed. So what we wanted to do at Hallam was provide a space for all those working within and across children and young people's education in our region. Reflect on how far we've come as a sector in meeting these needs, but also at this point in time, how we might continue to meet these needs as we move through this stage of transition and recovery. So we hope this space will provide a number of things. A space to share what we've achieved already, and so to hear what is happening across our region and beyond. The opportunity to hear from those who are harnessing this work in order to drive forward the next steps and lobby for support and change where this is needed, and we know it is. And the chance to connect with each other across our region and beyond, both to ensure that connections are maintained as we move forward, so to formulate our next steps and consider how we might influence more fundamental change as we begin to recover and repair. So just before I move on to our speakers, there's just one final point I want to make. We absolutely won't be able to cover everything this morning. this, as we are all very aware, is hugely complex and challenging. There will be groups of children and people that you may feel we haven't given enough space to this morning, and I appreciate that, and I apologise in advance. But please take the opportunity to talk to us about what we can do going forward. It is genuinely an open invitation. Please don't think that any of these children have been forgotten. So now I'm going to introduce our first speaker, our partner in our drive for a trauma-informed workforce across this region, and she is the co-director of Trauma Informed Schools UK, Julie Harmison. Over to you, Julie.
Okay, so we have a bit of a kind of, I'm now going to try and share a PowerPoint, and we'll just see how this goes. So hang on.
There's no pressure, Julie. There's no one looking. It's absolutely fine.
No, I can only see you, Sue. It's fine. So with a bit of luck now, this should work. Let's have a look. It's uploading. Sorry, I'll talk and introduce myself while it's doing this. It's very much for us, I think we're experiencing some of the criticism of the trauma-informed approach has previously been that it's a niche response for a few children. And actually, what we know around the Covid-19 pandemic is that actually we're experiencing this, not just our children, but the adults and the workforce around children also are experiencing this. And we may all be experiencing the same storm, but we're absolutely not in the same boat. And our perceptions and experiences of this will very much depend on our environment, our relationships, and our economic position, really. So what we do know is this is unifying us. We're all experiencing this. And I'm in the middle of a traumatic experience at the moment because I don't appear to be able to, oh, it says share now. There we go. There we are. So hopefully this you should be able to see a PowerPoint now. No, it was there and now it's gone again. Hang on.
Don't worry, Julie, if you can't do it, we can get Dave to step in, but I'm sure it will come up in a moment.
Okay, so there we are. Right, we're sorted.
Yeah, brilliant.
Very much I'll just be whizzing through, really kind of setting the context and also starting to think about how do we plan for recovery from this experience when potentially it is being experienced as traumatic, not just by our children and young people, but by the workforce who are going to be providing a steady base for them when we return. So is it a traumatic experience? And taking a definition of trauma that it's a response to any event that's encountered as out of control, frightening experience that disconnects us from all sense of resourcefulness, safety, coping or love, then absolutely yes, it is. And in terms of what we may be seeing, fear, panic and anxiety, again, this is not just about our children and young people, but our workforce are also experiencing this. Fear is often masked by anger, irritability, and certainly even monitoring our Twitter feeds at the moment, what we're seeing is a level of confrontation and kind of argumentativeness, because often fear is masked by anger. It's a defense, it's protective, and it's our go-to position to protect ourselves. At the other extreme, we're seeing overwhelm and tearfulness and revisiting of previous traumas that in some way are triggered by this experience. Again, if you look at social media, what we see is an urgent need to be useful and to be occupied and to be busy. And again, this is often when we have an overactivation of the fear system, we're driven to try and control the environment around us. And again, at the other end of that, what we may see is incapacitation. I'm finding the social media coverage of how dynamic some people are being really irritating, because I tidied one drawer and that's about it. We're also seeing disturbed sleep, and particularly in our children and young people, it's where we process our underlying unconscious worries. So we're seeing in children night terrors or a return to interrupted sleep and repeated wakening, but also these really vivid, disturbing dreams. An increased likelihood of depression and intrusive thoughts and those catastrophic catastrophic thinking and ruminations and all of the what ifs that may happen that expose our anxieties. The lockdown and school closure as a traumatic experience, again, hitting both children and adults. It's a sudden unwanted change over which we've had no control. It happened very rapidly. And for some children and for some adults, it's an attachment rupture, particularly for those children whose real strong attachments to the adults that care for them in school, and they're not experiencing that. Sue touched on earlier, a profound experience of loss, not just of bereavement, or undoubtedly that is happening for some children and families. And even those who are not experiencing bereavement as a result of COVID-19, their experience of grieving is curtailed, it's not public, there isn't social support that's been available for them, and there's no ritual. Funerals have changed dramatically as a result of social distancing. But children are also experiencing, and again adults, a loss of interaction with friends and their social group, and the social buffering and protective factors that offers. Significant relationships with adults may well have been curtailed. This may be adults in school, but it's also family members who may be shielding and they haven't seen or don't have access to for some period of time. Routine, structure, order, safety has gone, the freedom to act, and the ability to mark key milestones within life, birthdays, anniversaries, and those key things for year 6 and year 11 children who've prepared all the way through their education for and to be able to prove themselves. Actually, rather than feeling relief, some children are really angry that they don't have the opportunity to do that. We have children and adults who are experiencing isolation. As human beings, we don't do well on that. We thrive on social contact. We are all being marinated in a climate of fear. You cannot turn on the TV without being exposed to death rates. The message is stay at home. It's not safe to leave. And we're grappling with uncertainty and not knowing. And that also can raise fear and anxiety. Undoubtedly, there are adults who are trying to contain children and who also are feeling dysregulated, who may have their own health concerns, are grappling with the issues of poverty and the uncertainty around their jobs and strained relationships. When you're living cheek by jowl, then we become more fractious. And also added into the mix for some is the frustration of anticipated rewards, and thinking again about those year 6s facing transition into year 7 and year 11s who are leaving, of not having those opportunities, school camps, the school prom, and then feeling shame that actually that's what's preoccupying them. From secure attachments to insecure attachment, even those children and young people with experiences of secure relationships who have an internal working model of the world as safe and inviting and predictable, that's being shaken by the impact of COVID-19. And if we're thinking about the implications for our youngest of children who are still learning about attachments and relationships and other people being a source of support and comfort, that's being shaken. And for those with patterns of attachment that are anxious or avoidant, their internal working model of the world not being safe is absolutely being confirmed. Others cannot be relied on, and I need to manage this for myself. So the dilemma is that we have dysregulated adults and dysregulated children, and what they're doing is adding to the distress of the other. So the children and young people will be picking up on the emotional atmosphere of the adults that they rely on to keep them safe. And what we're seeing is an overactivation of the primitive instinctual alarm states that have the biochemistry of toxic stress, rage, fear, and panic grief. And what we know is that they suppress the pro-social systems of care or the attachment system, play and social joy in another, and the seeking system, interest in the world around us. And that has massive implications for learning and motivation and desire to be interested. The impact of that imbalance of biochemistry within the brain and body has an impact on us at a cellular level. So telomeres are the protective little caps that sit at the end of our chromosomes and protect our DNA. It's how we replicate our DNA. And as we age, these kind of sticky Velcro-y bits fray and naturally shorten. But what we know is that in situations of unalleviated high levels of stress, where cortisol is prevalent in high quantities in the body, it's associated with long-term health difficulties and early mortality because it shortens telomeres. So the solution is, I've lost a bit of my slide, I'm sorry about that. The optimal activation of the pro-social systems. If we can change the balance and focus on activating care, play and seeking, the biochemistry of calm and social engagement and optimal learning, what happens is it suppresses rage, fear and panic grief. And the way to do that is around an enriched relational environment. We release a cocktail of brain chemicals called brain-derived neurotrophic factor and an enzyme called telomerase. Telomerase protects telomeres and repairs damage, and brain-derived neurotrophic factor, when it's present in brain and body, really buffers against mental ill health. What are enriched relational environments? They're relationally rich. They have strong, positive relationships at the heart of everything. They are sensorially rich. There's shared enjoyment and social joy and fun. I delight in the presence of another. And there's a high novelty factor, and absolutely our schools can provide this. And a sense of belonging and connection is key as we move into a recovery period and bringing schools back together. And some of the things that in a trauma-informed approach that we'd advise about considering are, in terms of that recovery back together, is re-establishing relationships and repair. Because for some children, they will have experienced the closure, the lockdown of schools as an abrupt rupture of an attachment that was beginning to be significant and important. And that needs to be addressed and repaired. It clearly wasn't our fault, and we still need to reach out and reconnect. The impact of living in fear and in an environment that doesn't feel safe for some children means that their stress response is altered. Again, this is at a physiological level, and children have very little control over it, and adults have very little control over it. It's particularly alone and without the presence of someone who can co-regulate. In those situations, what we see is that the stress response is altered and switched on. So and to quote the work of Stephen Porges and social engagement polyvagal theory, removing a child from an environment of threat is not the same as experiencing safety. So bringing them back into the school environment will not be enough to support them to stand down and regulate. We have to do that through creating psychological safety to support the child to experience the world as safe again, and that's going to be a challenge because undoubtedly there will still be some social distancing in place when schools come back together, but also really focusing on helping reduce the stress state. So we have to co-regulate as a community too. Re-establishing structures, routines and boundaries. For some children, they may not have any. Even those children who are within school at this moment, our vulnerable children and those who are the children of key workers, they're experiencing school in a very different manner. And we're going to be making demands on them again. And to do that, we have to support them to feel safe, to re-experience those relationships and differences in relationships. They'll be experiencing their teachers in a very different way at the moment. To understand and sense of what has happened, to acknowledge the losses and mourn them. And those are the conceptual ones, as well as the loss and bereavement that undoubtedly is happening. And to find rituals collectively involving parents and the wider school community to mark that really brings together the community. And a key point really is, without optimal activation of care, seeking and play, learning really cannot happen, because rage, fear and panic grief suppress them and block learning, whether that's social and emotional or whether it is kind of academic. So there's a period where we need to resettle, regroup, re-establish safety and optimal activation of care, seeking and play, particularly seeking, which is suppressed by fear. And finally, we need to talk about it and to share experiences, because to quote, this is Fred Rogers, but simplifying this, what it means is what's shareable is bearable. We have a sense that someone else knows how it is and how it's been, that I am not catastrophically alone with this, then that alleviates our stress response, reduces the chemicals associated with stress, and facilitates those processes. So anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. And when we can talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. And the people we trust with that important talk can help us to know that we are not alone. And if anything, this is a common experience for us all. And when we share experience, it brings us together. So from adversity comes great learning. And I think there is much that we can learn from the experiences over the last 4-6 weeks, and whatever it will be until school communities are back together, that we can apply and take forward, and never have our children needed a trauma-informed approach more, and never have our staff either. I'm done, Sue.
Excellent. Almost on time. That's fantastic. Yeah. Do you want to just stop sharing your slides now so we can?
I will try.
Thank you so much, Julie. There's so much in there. As we've said a couple of times, this is being recorded, so people can go back and have a look and listen again to what you had to say, because there was so much in there, and we'll pick up some of those points in the question and answer session. And I just repeat, if people do have comments or questions, please do post them in the chat. And we'll be monitoring that as we go through. So thanks very much, Julie. So I'm going to hand over now to Rachel Parkin, who is, let me just check my notes, I've got two things going, which is never good for me, head of North of England at Save the Children UK. So Rachel, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sue. And thanks for that as well, Julie. So fascinating. I almost forgot that I was speaking next. So yeah, I'll definitely be listening back. As he said, I'm Rachel Parkin and I'm the head of North of England at Save the Children. So part of the team that's working on our UK response, or our UK work in general at Save rather than our international. And I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the national approach that Save the Children is taking to the COVID-19 response, which very much includes our work in the north of England and specifically in Sheffield as well. But before I get into that, I just want to say that really the approaches that we take only work because of the exceptional partnerships that we have, which brilliantly include the number of the speakers here today and South Yorkshire Futures who are hosting this event. And together we form the membership of with others of the Sheffield early learning communities, working together to support the early learning and development of young children in Sheffield's locality B. So just wanted to call out to partnerships there and just really say that any of the work that Save does really is in conjunction with our partners. So at Save the Children across the UK, we're focused on the early years and specifically on supporting families living in poverty to be their children's first educator. At all times, what we do is shaped by the experiences of children and their families, and this very much includes our response to COVID-19. We've taken a two-pronged approach, both calling for policy change to support families now and in the future, which we call the Family Rescue Package, which I'll talk through, and by addressing immediate needs for families, which is our emergency response for parents and children in the home. We also recognise that as this crisis unfolds and as we move into recovery, needs will change and our offer will also adapt in relation to that. So what I'm going to talk you through now is very much where we are at the moment. That may look different in the future as things change in the external environment. So starting off with the Family Rescue Package. So as you all know, there's been huge packages of support from the UK government in terms of a whole range of issues and options that they've put forward. But really, we feel that children are largely missing from this picture so far. And as we all know, the impact on family life is huge, both for those falling into poverty through the crisis and those who are being pushed deeper. So we're looking to achieve changes to policy that will lessen the financial pressure on families and that will support families on low incomes to support their young children's learning and development at home during this crisis. And we're doing that alongside others and looking to bolster public support for the need to protect children and families on low incomes from the economic implications of this crisis. So as I say, the UK government has set out some really welcome measures to protect those most at risk. I'm not going to list them all, but they do include the job retention scheme, making mandatory sick pay payable from the first day of illness, increasing the standard elements of universal credit, and allowing families to receive vouchers to replace free school meals. These are all really welcome and they're all really important, and they absolutely will help to mitigate the impact of the crisis on families. But sadly, as we all know, many families are still going to fall through the gaps. There's currently 4.2 million families living in poverty in the UK. That number was already set to rise even before COVID-19. Families are finding that their incomes are taking a hit at the same time as they're facing additional costs for essentials like food, heating, and internet access. Without support, they're going to struggle to cope. So what are we calling for? Firstly, to strengthen the safety net. So the government is understandably focused on protecting jobs in the first instance to ensure that as many people as possible are able to retain work and earn a living. But many people still face losing their jobs or seeing significant drops in their income as their hours or wages are reduced. And the social security system is really key to filling these gaps. And the government's announced some welcome increases to benefits, but families with children still need extra support. And to ensure that families on low incomes are supported to cover additional costs through this time, we're calling for the government to increase the child element of universal credit and child tax credit by at least £15 a week. And that increase would be targeted to support children who are most vulnerable to experiencing poverty and to take some of the burden of anxiety about finances from parents. As we know, anxiety and stress, and Julie has just talked us through, that can add to those pressures at home, which can take away from learning. And so we're really focusing on supporting parents to support their children and their learning at home. In addition to that additional £15 a week, obviously there's huge numbers who are now moving on to universal credit. And in the first couple of weeks, almost 1 million people made a new claim. That number is continuing to rise. For those families who are moving on to universal credit, they'll be forced to wait for 5 weeks before they receive their first payment. So they can either wait for that 5 weeks or they can take it out in advance and cover them over that period of time, which currently they'll have to repay, leaving them to struggle as that moves forward and as they start getting their payments. So we're calling for the government to urgently suspend all repayments of advances for at least 6 months, and ideally to work towards making advances non-repayable in the long term. So we know that's an issue beyond just this current crisis. So secondly, then we're looking for support for struggling families who fall ill. Many families are likely to fall ill during this crisis, and it's really crucial that they're able to remain at home to self-isolate in line with guidelines. Families on low income aren't always eligible for the same support for those on higher incomes if they have to take time off when they're ill, meaning that they're left facing a choice of a drop in income or continuing to go to work, putting themselves and many others at risk. Families shouldn't have to make that kind of a choice of working through illness or being left to struggle. So we're calling for the government to extend statutory sick pay to cover all employees, including those who earn less than £120 a week, to make sure that struggling families aren't penalised for falling ill. And then thirdly, we're calling for families to have access to digital access to support their children's learning. So again, the coronavirus has really exacerbated the digital access is essential for many households. School and nursery closures across the UK mean that children are now expected to do all of their learning at home, with resources often being made available to them, brilliant resources, but through online platforms and websites. Many families are struggling to pay their bills, or they don't have internet access at all, or they don't have sufficient devices in the home to be able to support that learning. And this crisis really risks exacerbating that impact of the digital divide further, leaving children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds to fall further behind in their learning. So we're calling on the government to ensure that all families have digital access to support their children's learning, including online connectivity, including access to devices, and by providing ongoing financial support for digital access. And obviously there have been announcements through the Education for data and devices to some children from disadvantaged areas, but we're really focusing that on the early years as well and bringing that back down to the earliest years and narrowing the gap or not allowing that gap to widen through this crisis. And then secondly, I just wanted to turn to the work that we're doing to support the immediate need at home. So on Monday, we launched our new emergency response grant programme for parents and children at home. Before the coronavirus outbreak, we know that children growing up in poverty often fall behind their better off peers from a very young age and find it hard to catch up. The economic conditions brought around by this pandemic mean that low income families need more help than ever to get through the crisis and to ensure early learning inequalities at home are not exacerbated. So with this grant programme, we're looking to support families living in poverty with their immediate needs by providing them with a package of essential items that contribute towards minimising financial pressure during the crisis and ensuring the continuity of children's early learning and minimising the inequality of the home learning environment. The grant is targeted at families where there's a child aged between 0 and 6, where they're already in poverty or they've been pushed into poverty, or one of our referral partners has identified that the child is particularly at risk of falling further behind in their early learning. We're initially supporting families across 11 of our existing UK delivery areas, which includes Sheffield, with an initial budget of about £1 million. And we have a funding appeal out at the moment with the aim to at least double that amount. Families will receive a combination of an early learning pack, which is designed around everyday routines, age-appropriate play, and encourages parent and child interaction to stimulate early communication and language skills, plus a combination of household vouchers, supermarket vouchers, and e-vouchers up to the value of about £250, and items from a gift in kind selection that are being donated to Save the Children for this programme from supporters. And currently those gift in kind items are from Hasbro toys, so including board games, Play-Doh and card games, and from Lego. And we're working with more to build up this gift in kind offer so we can broaden that out further. As I say, we launched on Monday and applications have been made from the very beginning, and the initial interest really to be focused around supermarket vouchers. And that's just an indication of how immediate the need is there for the basics for the families that we're working with. So we're really hoping that this appeal is going to allow at least double to 2 million, which to allow us to reach many more families affected by the crisis. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rachel. Just make sure I turn my microphone back on. That's excellent. Thanks, Rachel. Again, so much in there, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of those things in the Q&A session. And again, if people want to follow that up, then they can make that request either through the chat or through the information that we send out. But lots of really important work there in terms of calling for this safety net to be strengthened. So thank you very much for your input there, Rachel. Okay, so I'm hopefully now going to move on to Loic Menzies, who's the CEO for the Centre for Education and Youth. I haven't actually spoke to Loic this morning. So Loic, are you able to join us? Put your video and microphone on?
Yes, hi.
Excellent, brilliant. Thanks, Loic. Okay, so thanks, Rachel, and we'll hand over to you, Loic.
Great, and thank you. That was brilliant, really fascinating insights, and then it feels like there's a lot that I'm going to touch on here that I think we can kind of build on and reinforce some of those themes that just came out. So yeah, as Sue said, I'm Chief Executive of the Centre for Education and Youth. So we're a think and action tank made up of former teachers, former youth workers. We've all moved into the world of research and trying to inform policy and practice with the kind of evidence that it needs. So we've been quite busy since all of this kicked off, and one of the things I want to talk to you about today is a roundtable we held a few weeks back, where we tried to pull out some of the themes that were already coming out of the sector, bringing together people not just from schools but also from worlds of educational psychology, from youth services, and thinking about how this is affecting different types of schools as well. So I'm going to present to you today about 3 of the main themes that came from that. So one is around resources and curriculum. The second is around the workforce. And the third is around outreach, well-being, safeguards, so on. So, and I particularly want to focus on the latter 2 of those. And I think what's really interesting about this is that things are moving just so fast, aren't they, right now? And I'm sure you'll all be experiencing that. And when I look back at what we wrote just 2 or 3 weeks ago, it's amazing to see what areas there have been progress on, what areas haven't moved on, and what new areas are coming up. So it's a really nice moment, I think, now to reflect on that a little bit. So to start off with resources and curriculum, I think this overlaps quite a lot with some of the things Rachel was talking about. This question of the digital divide, which is a term that's often thrown around, but has never been clearer in terms of its implications. And I'm really pleased that the work we did through that roundtable helped to push for some of that those government decisions around providing some access to technology. But I think, as Rachel said, it's really clear that to have such a narrow offer that only benefits a small number of groups you know, to focus on year 10s and so on, it isn't enough yet, and it's really important that we push. And I think that focus on the early years is so important, and that will come in to some of the things I'm going to say about transitions later as well. The second area under resources and curriculum is around content. So what is it? You know, we had a small hiatus to some extent over the Easter holidays, which I think provided a bit of a moment for regrouping, despite the fact that schools were open, despite the fact that, you know, many teachers were working hard in that period. I think there was a little bit of a kind of regrouping and rethinking about what might be provided. We saw the launch of the Oak National Academy. And I think if you look what they're doing right now, they've got a real push on accessibility, on inclusion, and on SEND resources, which are where they're going to be focusing their efforts at the moment, which I think is welcome, because there's a big danger with big initiatives like that too often it's the vulnerable and the marginalised young people who have forgotten from that. So I think that's welcome, but we need to keep up the pressure on that front and to make sure everyone's included. But we also need to be thinking about what the content of this, of what's being provided is. And I've been really pleased to hear examples of schools sending home learning packs that don't just involve sort of curriculum learning, but also provide ideas of things that families might do together, cost-free things that families might do together, which can build and help insulate against some of those trauma, for example, things that we were hearing about from Julie earlier on. You know, creating those playful experiences that families can enjoy, because I think that we're in this really difficult time. But what we also need to try and do is to draw out some of the more golden special moments that might come from this, because ultimately families are spending more time together than usual, and we need to, that will, as we've seen in so many cases, have problematic consequences, but it can also have really rich and special moments. We've just been doing some research with Exeter University, looking at families' experiences of home learning, and we're seeing that some parents and some kids are really delighted to spend a different type of time together than they might do. So let's try to that, and rather than just focusing on a problematic dimension, let's try and draw that out and replace it with something positive. Moving on to workforce. So back a few weeks ago, we had no idea to what extent our workforce was going to be decimated by this crisis, and how difficult it would be to staff. And I think what we're seeing is a real heterogeneity about schools' experiences here. So if you look at the experiences of alternative provision schools, PRUs and so on, where such a large proportion of our pupils will fall under the vulnerable umbrella, their experience is categorically different to schools with smaller numbers of vulnerable young people. And therefore we need to be looking at how this crisis is impacting on schools' workforces, depending on their context. And we're seeing that particularly for AP, one of the concerns is that the social services are more stretched than ever. So this is bringing again to the fore an issue that's been there for a long time, underlying many of the issues in our sector, but now it's being thrown into stark relief. So social services are being overstretched, and suddenly schools are having to, particularly those AP schools, are having to jump in and perform the work that those services have to do. Yet they're not always staffed to do so. And one of the things I think we really need to be doing is making sure that we're upskilling rapidly the workforce in those institutions to be able to step into unfamiliar roles. And that means things like professional supervision. So we know that in social services, in psychology and so on, one of the things the workforce is provided with is regular supervisions to reflect on the experiences they're having, think about their practice, and bringing some of those kind of models into the work that people are doing is going to be needed. And in the longer term, I think this raises really important questions for pastoral roles within schools. So I think, for example, the role of a form tutor is going to be much more important as we step into the recovery phase, because processing a lot of those experiences, as Julie was talking about, is a role that may well fall to form tutors, despite the fact that in often being a form tutor is like a kind of side job and an afterthought in many schools when it comes to a teacher's role. Suddenly that's going to become much more central, and we need to think about how schools are preparing their form tutors to perform that really important role. So I think flipping priorities around kind of curriculum and pastoral for teachers in the recovery phase might become quite important. Finally, I'm just going to move on to the outreach, wellbeing, safeguarding area. So firstly, who are we talking about? Now, a lot of the decisions that are being made at the moment almost refer to a binary of the vulnerable pupils versus the non-vulnerable pupils. Now, any of us who work with young people know that that's not how it works. There's not this group over here who are defined because they're FSM or SEND as being vulnerable, or that, and pupils are becoming vulnerable as a result of this. So there's this real fluidity between vulnerable and less vulnerable, and therefore it's not going to have these initiatives that are targeted specifically either at vulnerable or not vulnerable pupils. So you know, some schools are addressing that by doing a more kind of gradated response, RAG rating their pupils, for example. But there's going to have to be constant re-evaluation of who is receiving what support. I think Julie's spoken a lot about the kind of traumatic elements of this, so I won't say much more. But I'm starting to see schools gearing up to consider their response to bereavement, for example, which I think is really important. Working out how they're going to partner with any ed psychs who they normally work with, who can provide guidance to schools on how to deal with these things. Schools are starting to prepare resources for when they come back to help their staff support pupils through bereavement, remembering that bereavement will not just affect pupils, but it will also affect teachers. And what happens to those spaces that are left when people come back together. The next big area for me is transitions, and by transitions I mean yes, we often talk about the primary secondary school transition, but we're also going to have pupils who are coming into school from nurseries who would normally have been prepared for that transition, but who won't have had that same preparation. Similarly, pupils moving even from reception into year one is actually quite an important transition. A lot of that preparation won't have happened, and so will need to happen actually in the next term after coming through. So we may see phases needing to be extended further to ease that transition. And I'm encouraged by transitions. I mean, sorry, I'm just seeing a question come up. I mean transitions between phases, but there are also implications when it comes to pupils being assessed for EHCPs and transitioning onto different forms of support. A quick thing is also transitions into post-16, and I'm seeing some providers provide some kind of pre-enrollment work for pupils to do, and I think that might be worth thinking. If you have pupils about to arrive, what can you give them to get started with? I think I'm going to leave it there because I've been talking a while and raised lots of issues, but I think if you just kind of, it's perhaps helpful to organise our thoughts under those different titles of resources and curriculum, workforce, and outreach and wellbeing. Thanks.
Thanks, Loic. That's fantastic. Yeah, again, lots of food for thought and overlap with in a great way with what Julie and Rachel have been saying, and great to put it into those three areas. And I particularly like the reinforcement of this idea that we're not in vulnerable versus not vulnerable. We're all our children are vulnerable in different ways at this time, as we ourselves are, as Julie was saying. And again, the idea of transitions, not just the most obvious transitions, but for all children at different stages. So thanks for that. And I think we'll pick some of those things up in the Q&A later. Okay, so it won't surprise you to know we've already caught up the time we've lost we gained from not having Helen here. So I'm now going to hand over to Ian Reid. Ian is our local head teachers at Watercliff Meadow Community Primary School in Sheffield. So over to you, Ian. Thanks.
Hi, Sue. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Okay, I can't even tell whether you can see me or hear me, but I'm just going to talk. So when Sue asked me to do this, I did say I'm not an expert, but I can tell the story of what we've done during this period. If she'd said you're talking to 360 people that you can't see, I would have just said no, I think. But anyway, I'm here, so here it goes. I think hopefully I'm going to pick up on some of the things the speakers have said. Just to give you a bit of context, at my school, we're in the northeast of Sheffield. We have between 50 and 55% free school meals, 25% SEN. In most weeks, we kind of have between 30 and 50 safeguarding cases that we're discussing. Sometimes it's a little bit more, rarely is it less than that. I'm going to talk about three aspects in the next 7 minutes or so. We're going to pick up on learning at home, safeguarding and well-being, and I've got just end with a few thoughts about the future, which kind of ties in with I think what other people have already said. But before I get onto that, I just want to say, share some of the principles that we were working under when we started. And what I would say is, in the first 3 weeks, I hadn't heard from any other head teachers at all, hardly. So I had no idea what was going on outside our own community. But in the past couple of weeks, I've spoken to quite a lot of head teachers across the city, and I've been really quite humbled, really, by some of the things that people are doing for their community. And this is what we're doing for our community. So when this all started, I always, even in the worst of times, I look for the opportunity in things and how can we continue to keep moving forward as a school. We talked about lots of ways we thought we could do that in this current situation. But to be honest, after just that first week, we realised lots of that just wasn't going to be possible. I mean, you can't. We realised we weren't going to do, and I realised pretty quickly that actually most of what we've done since then and are still doing and will continue to do is pretty much just damage limitation, really. But there were three areas that I thought we can continue as a school to keep moving forward, and they were first and foremost continuing to build those relationships we've got with families in a very different way, but we thought that was really, really important to be as successful as we can. So that's kind of one of our key operating principles, I suppose. Never before as staff have we had this kind of time. So one of the things I felt like I told my staff I think we can keep moving forward with, or you can keep moving forward with, is your own well-being. Because all my staff, I expect it's part of their appraisal that they have their own personal care plan. Well, this was kind of an ideal time to make sure you're doing those things to look after yourself, both physically and emotionally. And I've said you've basically got three choices in terms of physically looking after yourself. You can get fitter, you can get fatter, or you can get fitter and fatter. And I encourage people to do the first one of those, obviously. And I'll come back to that staff wellbeing bit when I talk about safeguarding. The other thing I thought we can continue to move forward with was just getting stuff done in school that actually we've got the time to do that we never usually got to. So we're kind of slowly working our way through those sort of things to put us in a better position, really, when we come back in September fully or whenever that might be. So they were kind of the things that we're trying to be doing all the way through. In terms of learning, we've done what lots of schools have done. We kind of the week before it hit and lockdown happened, we'd been preparing, and we dedicated staff meeting time to preparing resources, and we kind of prepared a pack of 4 weeks worth of stuff, but included some other kind of workbooks from school that would keep families going longer than that. And on that Friday, we took out, I think there were about 300 children in the school, so we had to take out and deliver about 250 further packs beyond that to make sure people had got those resources. And then we did things like we set up Google Classroom for year 3 to 6. We've used our website and the blogs on there for kind of setting daily challenges and posting things that families sent in. I was going to show you actually, well, in fact, I was going to show you the impact of that. I might just talk you through it. And certainly in terms of like Google Classroom, it's definitely appealing to those more self-motivated children, but definitely not to everyone. The learning packs families have definitely used, we know that. Our teachers are having weekly conversations with families, so we kind of are getting a sense of what people are doing and from the things that they send it into the blog. And I think the blog has been our key kind of way in. And I think the other thing that we recognise, and I think Lois picked up on this, is that this, for families, there was an opportunity here to really promote family time and the kind of more positive time aspects of being together and that's was definitely really important for our families. So we've tried to promote that through what we're doing. So the blogs are the kind of key way in now, as people have used up those learning packs. And what's been really interesting is we didn't know when we started how much access our families had got to the internet, how easy that was, how much data they got. So in those weekly conversations, we've asked staff to find that out. And what we've discovered is across school, less than 10% don't have access to internet easily. So that means most of our families do, which was really reassuring. And so that kind of use of the bloggers, we've tracked and have asked teachers to send in their their stats, if you like, weekly. And rather than show you, I'll just describe what it looks like. So in the first week, there was definitely increased activity on our blog. Over Easter, that dipped. And we asked staff after Easter to kind of really promote that and kind of direct families to those posts at 9 o'clock that set daily learning challenges, and also to submit pictures from their days kind of learning, and then they were posted a bit kind of between 3 and 5. And there's lots of other things we're doing, and we're doing lots of individual kind of work, you know, for SEN children, for vulnerable families who might not have access to internet. But essentially 90% of our families are going through that channel. And the blog stats are really interesting because it kind of goes up at the start of COVID, it dips in the Easter holidays, and then after those phone calls, it rises significantly. Like we're getting 2,000 hits plus per day on some of the blogs that we'd never had close to that. But what's interesting is the number of visitors, and across school the pattern's the same. Because of those phone calls and that relationship we've got with families, we're managing to encourage every day. I foundation stage have set up Facebook pages, and they're getting 56 out of 60 kids, families accessing those pages. So we know we're actually getting to a lot of our families, most of our families. Now we've no control over the quality of what they're doing, or you know, how effective that is, but at least we know, and we've got some way of tracking that is making a difference, and it's helping to continue those relationships. So I'm kind of really quite pleased about that. But we're only 5 weeks in, and we potentially have a long way to go still. So continuing those relationships and continuing to encourage families is an ongoing thing that we're doing, really. Okay, so I'm talking about learning, and like I say, most schools will be doing something really good for their community. That's working for us. I'm going to move on to safeguarding and well-being, because like everyone's described so far, that is becoming week by week an increasingly significant aspect of the work we're all doing. It always is for us. You know, while most of our teaching staff and support staff are currently in one every 4 weeks, I've got 3 members of staff in full time plus me, and that's pretty much all that we're working on. Our weekly safeguarding meetings used to be about an hour. They're now taking a whole morning, and we're finding out information in ways that we didn't because we'd see the kids, and now that's all coming through. It's all coming through the parents, and those conversations we're either having on the phone or seeing them in person, because we go into the home and doing home visits, obviously social distancing when we're doing that. But we're seeing that increase in vulnerability as time goes on. So we've done what most schools have done in terms of supporting free school meal families and getting those vouchers to them, painful as though that's been. But we're starting to see more families coming through. So we've already added 10%, almost 10% to our free school meal numbers since the start of COVID. We put out a message about 3 weeks ago to our non-free school meal families asking if anyone would make use or wanted a food parcel. So that about 3 weeks ago, that was 25 families, I think it was. The next week it went up to 30, mid-30s. I don't know what this week's numbers are. They'll come in today, but I expect that will rise to over 40, which is getting on for another 10% of families that are really, really struggling. And our families have been fantastic in that they when they're coming in to pick up the parcels, you know, they're not necessarily taking all the food if they know they won't use it. We've had families say, you know, we're okay this week. Let somebody else have it. And we've kind of accessed all kinds of different agencies, food banks. We tapped into a grant from Hallam Cash for Kids, but a lot of the food coming in was pretty random, really. So one of our teachers last week did some fundraising through his friends, through teachers, through people in you, and we raised over £5,000. And what that will enable us to do will be able to provide regular, on top of the e-vouchers and what the free school meal families are getting, which is now over 60% of our families, for another growing 10% and more of our families will be able to provide a regular weekly food parcel that actually has in food we can order through our catering suppliers, that will provide a kind of whole family meals, because we can choose what it is that we put in there, and that's huge, really. We're putting in with that parcel kind of recipe card, so that hopefully we can do a bit of teaching families how to cook while we're at it. And we're also kind of wanting to set up a board game library, so that when families come and take the parcels, they can take a board game to kind of play with, because that's definitely something that some of our families are that bored they'll try anything to make their lives better, I think. So that's kind of, I think, describes how we've experienced safeguarding. I mean, we're just dealing with the basics at the moment and providing emotional support really for some of those most struggling families, and having very regular conversations with them. In terms of staff wellbeing, it's been interesting because, as well as
Ian, we just need to wrap up in a minute, if that's okay. Thank you.
Looking after yourself, I think what I've realised is the importance of having a purpose, because I've always had a purpose in my life, and for the first 2 weeks that kind of just went, and I realised how important that is. So we've tried to provide stuff that they can do in school without increasing staff numbers. So we've got like a tidy team, a food parcel team that come in, and that's really helping people get through just that connection with fellow colleagues and seeing people and having something to do. So I'm going to wrap up. I think the hardest part is going to be coming back, and I think we've got an opportunity here to, as a education community across the country, really to ask for a reset, because I don't know about other people, but I've never had evenings to myself for like 15 years. Where I haven't got work to do. I've never had a Sunday where I don't spend all day working, and it's really quite nice. And it's made me think what a load of crap that we do in our jobs that really isn't necessary. And I think we ought to be saying that loud and clear as educators, that when the Conservative government came in, they took the word families out of the DFE, and we've never stopped doing that work, because we recognise that actually you can't get to learning if your children don't have good social and emotional well-being, and your families don't, all the trauma-informed stuff. And we've carried on doing that, and hopefully one of the things that the government might recognise, or people might recognise, is the importance of not just the job we do in teaching, but also to support the social and emotional well-being of children and families. And I think that's where maybe we can push for a reset on education in this country. Thank you.
Ian, as always, I was absolutely inspiring, and I could absolutely listen to you all day. So I'm sorry that we've only given you a short amount of time. But
can I just say one more thing? Just one more thing.
Go on then.
Because what I read, something the Children's Commission wrote last week, that said that by the age of 14, I was fascinated by this. By the age of 14, I don't know where this research comes from, but 2/3 of the attainment gap at age 14 is created by summer holidays. That's what he said research was saying. In this period till September, we'll have 4 back-to-back summer holidays in 1 year. Because whatever happens, I cannot see us being back fully before September. That attainment gap is going to be massive for everyone, but particularly for disadvantaged children. Thanks, I am done.
Very wise words, Ian. Absolutely, and lots of comments coming through on the chat in response to what you've said. So you have a chance to look through them, although they will be recorded as well, so we can play that back. But as always, what comes through from you, Ian, is this importance you've always placed on the relationships with families. That absolutely has come to the fore now, and I think that's something we could all reflect upon. And I also think, when you were talking about the importance of purpose for staff, I think that's something, as you say, that we're all struggling with a little bit. What is our purpose at this particular time? So, as you know, I've always admired what you do in terms of looking after your staff, and I'm sure that you can see that that's continuing through this, and ties in again with what Julie was saying earlier. So thanks very much, Ian. Now I'm going to put my colleague Sally into an impossible situation, because she's got to try and pull together some questions from the chat. We've got about 15-20 minutes. We will not have time to go through all the questions, I'm absolutely sure. But as I said at the beginning, any question that is posed will not go unheard, and we will be picking some of them up. I'll pass it to you, Sally, to take us through the Q&A session.
Okay, thank you, Sue. Because of the technology issues of trying to move around speakers and get you on screen, I'll try and direct them to people as they where the questions came up in terms of the order of speakers. Julie, just to put you on your guard, there's a couple here. We had from Maureen Hunt and from Karen Smith, whether you could just explain a little bit more about what you mean when you talk about seeking. Thank you for answering the question already, Julie, about sharing the slides. That's brilliant, because there's quite a few questions about that. But if you could just pick up on the seeking one, that would be great.
Yeah, so the seeking system is around, it's kind of really rich in brain biochemistry that keeps us engaged and focused and gives us drive and enthusiasm and motivation. It's really characterized by curiosity, and fear suppresses it, because if you're anxious around the world, then about the world and exploring, then you're really hesitant to go out and do it. And it's really difficult to activate the seeking system without a co-adventurer alongside, an adult who really facilitates, keeps you safe, applies language, and supports your attention. The seeking system and an optimal activation of the seeking system facilitates children and adults to be engaged in a task, to have kind of the drive to go and find out, and not be a passive learner. These are the kids that are like, wow, I want to do that. What does this do? How does that happen? How can I find out more about this? And gives us a lifelong love of learning. And in lockdown, undoubtedly, it's going to be suppressed. So we've got to reactivate that with children. It's rich in dopamine, which facilitates concentration and task engagement and being able to really see a task through to the end. And it's so hard to activate the seeking system in an adult when it hasn't been optimally activated in childhood. And you will know those people, because when you suggest a really bright idea and this is amazing, they're the ones that find the blocks, the barriers, and suck the joy from you. So we don't need another a generation of mood hoovers growing up as a result of a compromised seeking system. It comes from the work of the concept. There's a beautiful YouTube clip, and I can share that with the team so that they can pass that on to you, of Yak talking about his work, and particularly around the pro-social systems. That's really informative. So we're happy to share that, and it utterly underpins our work, is that the activation of those pro-social systems, buffer against stress.
Okay, thank you, Julie, and thank you for chipping in on the chatters. So I know you've answered some people directly. For Rachel from Save the Children, there was some questions about where does the grant apply, if you could pick up on that, and a question from Abby Bolton about what any thoughts about the Northern Powerhouse request of £700 per disadvantaged student to offset the disparity with students in the south. If I could bring you back in there, Rachel.
Yeah, of course, no problem. Thank you, Sally, and thank you for all of the questions coming through on the side. In terms of the areas that we're working with, initially we're working in 7 areas across the UK, and we have been kind of working through where we're already have partnerships in the first instance, so we could get cracking with this grant. In the north of England, they're in Sheffield, as I mentioned, plus Smallshawhurst in Greater Manchester and Wallsend in North Tyneside. We also have 3 sites in the south of England that we're working with as well: Feltham in West London, Tower Hamlets in East London, and Margate in Kent. Those areas are linked with our early learning communities, which I mentioned, where we have in Sheffield, plus children's communities, where we have 2 of those in the north of England. In Wales, we're working in Cardiff and Newport. In Northern Ireland, in Belfast and Derry, and in Scotland, we're working in Edinburgh. So we have a spread across the UK in the first wave. we are looking to understand where we could move into in the second wave as we get more money in through that appeal as well. So thank you for those suggestions that are coming in. I mean, the need across the country is just phenomenal, and it's really difficult, to be honest, to try to decide where to go with that. But really appreciate those points in the chat. In terms of the Northern Powerhouse request, I mean, I think this is definitely something for us to look into more broadly in terms of our calls and where we can influence. I mean, it's just obvious that there is a divide between the North and the South in terms of the resources across the board, and I think with the economic aspects particularly, we need to be really careful in terms of thinking through what those differences are going to be in the future as well. So I'm not going to give you a direct answer on that one, but it's definitely one that I want to pick up on. And Ali, I might even be in touch with you subsequent to this to talk to you directly as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. For Loic, a question from Gary Simmons. You suggested that the role of the form tutor will be crucial as we move forward. What suggestions do you have for preparing teachers for this role? I don't know if you're there, Loic.
Hi, great question. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I think this is the sort of thing that that we'll need to start quite soon, really, in terms of preparation. And I think it's about identifying what, some of those issues that we heard about from Julie earlier on, about what are the things that people might be struggling with when they come back, and what does best practice suggest in terms of how you support people with those. But also remembering that kind of relationships are obviously the bedrock to anything that you're going to do on any of those fronts. So thinking about how are you going to re-establish secure and trusting relationships when people come back, how are form tutors going to be able to build that kind of bond between the pupils in those groups, what kind of experiences might you want to plan for them to build those and broker them. But preparation, and we don't normally prepare staff to support pupils through bereavement and all those other things as regular issues for them to be coming up with. So bringing them into discussions with any ed psychs that you work with to help them understand how you support people through that. Because one of the important things that was raised at our round table was that a lot of these things don't happen straight away. So it may be that pupils might come back and might be okay for a while, but things can resurface at different points. So preparing form tutors to see those moments where things are coming to the surface as some form of normality returns, so that they can spot those things and respond further down the line when they're needed. And the same goes with transitions, which I mentioned, because there's some really good research looking at people's experiences of transitions from primary to secondary school, suggesting that it's not a moment. A transition is not a moment; it's a process. And a lot of the experiences of transition come up a year later as people are no longer kind of in that nurtured space of the first year of school. So helping people to negotiate that as they go forward. And a form tutor is that point of constancy, that regular contact who can get to know a pupil individually and spot when something's not quite right and provide personal support on that.
Okay, thank you. I've got it's quite a strong thread came through when you finished speaking, Loic, about early years, which I'm very pleased to see. Firstly, about any views on transitions into school for those children who may not have had the home visits and contacts leading up to the summer holidays, but also views on Year 1 teachers keeping the EYFS continuous provision going for those children who have missed the summer term in Foundation 2. So it's a question, any views on those, on the transition for early years and continuing the EYFS approach into Year 1 for those children who have missed out on the final term?
Yeah, I'm very much not an expert on those phases, so I've referred some people in the chat to our head of research, Ellie Mulcahy, on Twitter, who's going to be doing some work looking into this a bit more. So I'd say watch this space on this one. I'll see what we can dig up. But I think I'd be really interested to hear from colleagues who work in those phases, what their ideas are and what they think. What are the normal stress points and what are the normal issues, but what might be different this time.
Okay, and I know we have a number of early years experts in the audience who will probably get in touch with you about that. A couple of questions for Ian. Whether you made any progress or had any thoughts on reaching the 10% you mentioned who pupils who don't have regular internet access.
Yeah, I mean, so two ways, through phone calls and visits, really. So we've got in touch with all our families, and the most vulnerable ones, we've kind of got a spreadsheet which Fiona Rigby, I know she's in the audience, provided, which is really helpful. So that we're tracking all our vulnerable children, all our vulnerable families. So they'll be on that kind of overview spreadsheet, and each week teachers will send in a spreadsheet of their class and flag up any issues that they've picked up through phone conversations. So, and that's part of the reason why the safeguarding meetings are taking so long, because we're looking at far more children in detail of what those gaps are. So I mean, our secretary at the moment is working pretty much full time on providing individual stuff, whether that's packs or whatever it is, or having conversations with those kind of vulnerable SEN children. So we're trying to, because we've narrowed it down to a fairly small group in terms of the learning aspect, we're able to target much more to what that family need.
Okay, thank you. And the last one, it might be a bit of a challenge, as you said, we're in an unknown situation, but have you any thoughts on, this is from Terry Clare, on how social distancing could work in school?
Well, I mean, at the moment, it's fairly straightforward. I say it's fairly straightforward. We've opened up classrooms, so we've got more space. We're spreading children out. The younger kids, we're sitting in hoops because they're quite used to sitting in hoops, so they spread out. But you know, it depends on numbers, because with the best will in the world, you cannot, as it's been said in the media, you're not going to stop children, you know, wanting to hug and wanting to touch each other, and then just in the play. So I think, to a certain extent, it's impossible. But I think there are things that we can do to try and encourage social distancing, and we've definitely. One particular teacher who's really hugging, like he will hug everyone, and we've taught him not to. He's, you know, which is kind of sad in a way, but actually, so I think people generally in society have picked up on what social distancing mean. You know, we all understand that. Practically in a primary school, it's going to be very difficult when numbers get to a certain point. It's difficult already, but I think we will do what we can to encourage that as much as we can. But to be realistic, we're not going to be able to do it for all the time for everyone.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all the questions we probably have time for, Sue. So I'll hand back to you.
Okay, lovely, thanks. I think I'm on there now. Okay, so yeah, so thanks for all those questions, and I'm sure there's lots more that we can ponder, and we will have a session later again for more question and answers, and obviously we've got more speakers to bring into that conversation. Just as a comment, is people are putting links to other things on the chat. That's absolutely fine, and please feel free to do that. I can see, and it's very humbling and slightly scary, the range of expertise we've got in the audience. So yes, please do keep sharing links and thoughts and ideas through the chat there. Okay, so I think now we'll take a 10-minute break. I think that's long enough to have a comfort break, put the kettle on, make a cup of tea, do whatever you want to do, and then we can come back. We try and come back for 20 past. So if all the speakers can be back and ready for 20 past, then we can make sure we don't lose any time. And then again, we'll kick off then at 20 past. If the speakers just want to make sure their microphones and audio are switched off while we just have a break and be back at 20 past, that's fantastic. So thank you, and I'll see you all in about 10 minutes. So I think hopefully everyone's back at their desk, sofa, dining table, wherever they happen to be, not in the garden today. So again, I think we have all the speakers in the background with their microphones off. I remember to put mine back on this time. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker for the afternoon. We're going a little bit more regional now in terms of more examples of what we're doing in our area. So I'm going to introduce now Pepe Diazio, who's Assistant Director of Education for Rotherham and also Head Teacher at Wales High School in Rotherham. So over to you, Pepe.
Thank you, Sue. I'm just going to try and share the PowerPoint that I've hurriedly put together this morning. Once I saw that Julie had got a PowerPoint, I thought, well, I'll try and throw one together so that at the very least people are not having to look at my face for the next 7 minutes. So I feel quite humbled that I've been asked to speak along with some of the other colleagues that have joined us this morning. And actually, I wanted to apologise because I'm going to talk about structures from a local authority perspective and my work as AD in Rotherham across Rotherham schools. But I also work across the north of England with other ADs across Yorkshire, Humber and the northeast as well. And actually, when you hear about what other people have been talking about this morning from guests, colleagues such as Ian and Julie, I'm not going to be very child-centred here, child-focused. I'm going to talk about structures, and I'm almost embarrassed to be doing so. So what I would say is, in introduction, the last 10 years has seen a massive change to the educational landscape, and I think that we all recognise that a key aspect of that has been the fragmentation of schools through multi-academy trusts and an academisation process that has meant that local authorities, to all intensive purposes with education, are only responsible and only hold colleagues together for a number of key issues such as safeguarding. However, I think what we're finding at this time of crisis is that our public services are at the heart of so much that we need to do. And so what has come to bear in the last 6-7 weeks is how important these public services are and how integral they are to responding to the emergency situations that we're in. And what I'm going to say is that everything that I share with you over the next 5 minutes could not have been done without the support of CEOs, head teachers and schools across the whole of Rotherham, who have come together in a really collegiate and collaborative way and have come together within minutes. We were told at one point that schools were closing, and within an hour we had a strategic overview of what was happening across Rotherham and what we were doing in preparation for the lockdown. And so that takes me to my first slide, really, which is what we did to try and prepare for the lockdown situation. And when I say prepare, it was done within a matter of hours. And what we needed to do was gain a strategic overview so that we had an understanding of what provision was like across the whole of Rotherham, so that we were aware that we could put support in where was necessary, bring together hubs where it was appropriate, where small schools were unable to do what they needed to do, but also put support in for special schools and for our PRUs, where actually some vulnerable children were going to be even more at risk during the lockdown period. We also needed to make sure that we shared best practice. I think we're all learning about remote learning and making sure that best practice was shared across the region and make sure that was communicated amongst all stakeholders and partners, not only within education, but nationally through the health service, through Public Health England, through the police, for fire, CAMS, and a whole range of different providers. So I call that phase one, which was preparation for lockdown. We quickly moved to what I would then call phase two, which is making sure that we had a strategic work plan for what was going to happen during lockdown. Within there were some bumps in the road. So we're still in what I would call phase two. We had to try and understand how we came together with other partners, how we linked with the construction area for new schools that were being built, schools that are being opened, SEND hubs that are being constructed as we speak, how we linked with the Army, who were part of our logistics response for getting PPE to special schools and to providers, how we linked with the police and care workers to make sure that we had schools that were open across the whole authority during particular areas, and how we linked with the third sector and support agencies and charities to help us provide something that was beyond that of just schools and perhaps more than the sum of our individual parts. Tough times during phase two, what we were going to do around Easter, how can we make sure that we had schools that were open over the bank holiday periods when a lot of other things were in absolute lockdown. Other things that we had to cope with, just moving swiftly forward, is how we aligned hub models to support all communities, because multi-academy trusts and schools don't necessarily fit into geographical areas and do not necessarily support rural areas and smaller areas, and how we make sure we help one another to allow that. how we've tried to make sense of messages from the DfE around free school meals, so finding out firsthand what will happen for our most vulnerable students during the lockdown, and how we manage that, and how we roll out Secretary of State announcements, which are then declared to us, that we then have to make happen and help land. Even in the middle of that, changes in emphasis and definitions around what vulnerable children are, and working with social care and individual schools to make sure that we have eyes on our most vulnerable children, and what those vulnerable children look like and who they actually are. Because I think what's come out of the last couple of weeks is that our looked after children actually have got quite an intense eye on them, and quite a number of people looking at them. But there are a tier of children and a cohort of children below those vulnerable children that are identified as having social workers, that don't necessarily have the emphasis put on them at the moment, or the eyes on them at the moment. And they are, perhaps in my opinion, some of our most vulnerable during this lockdown period. And then most recently, we've had a laptop rollout, which again was announced on a Sunday, with no information and no idea, and very little cognizance given to the safeguarding implications of handing out 300,000 laptops, and online implications to young people who are in a vulnerable situation. So they've been the bumps in the road over what I would call phase 2 that we've been looking at, and phase 3 as we move into what I would call the new norm, and really trying to establish some level of consistency beyond Easter, and looking forward to beyond May half term, where we start to consider what the new norm may look like, and how we can make sure that we bring some consistency to that, evaluate how things have gone, take account of national offers that are being rolled out, but also start to plan for what a return to schools may look like, because there is a lot of talk at the moment about schools in some way, shape or form looking to return in June. So that takes me to phase 4 and the challenges of what June or whatever that day may look like, and really how we look to plan to reverse what has got into play in phase 1, and make sure we learn lessons from that. You know, I was really intrigued to hear Ian say earlier about things not being the same, and Sunday evenings not being the same for him. But also, I think there's so many other things that should not be the same in the future, and we need to make sure we take advantage of this situation, whether that be how we take advantage of new assessment criteria, or how we take advantage of our work with Ofsted, or our work with partners, to make sure we make the best out of what has been locked down, and the things that we've learned from lockdown. And I suppose as we move forward into stage 4, the next stage is for us to meet with CEOs and head teachers about what the barriers are and what the challenges are to returning. Other colleagues already this morning have already spoke about the surge that we're all anticipating around issues around whether that be domestic abuse, online abuse, and making sure that we help tackle all the associated traumas that will come from those specific things, but also just the idea of being away from that consistency that is school, and that stability that so many children get from having that known factor within their life. And we've got to remove those barriers before we start to talk about how we return to school. And I think that although I made an apology at the start about this being a very structure-based presentation, in all of that we need to remain very child-centred and make sure that we consider what it's like to be a child at this moment, and how we ensure we equip our teachers and our school workers to make sure that we can support children as they go forward. I guess finally, Sue asked me to consider what we might need to think about in terms of the next stages. I've been really impressed with the presentations from the start of today's webinar, because it's clear to me that with the likes of the third sector and trauma-informed schools, and some of the work that Luke's shared with us today, that actually teachers are already thinking about what will schools be like when we return, and I think our momentum must be that we take control of this situation. The thing that has come out of this in the very first 10 minutes of lockdown for me is that there was an expectation perhaps that head teachers were hoping that we would get some direction from above about what things would look like and how things would be led and managed. And what has become clear to me is there is no expectation from above, there is no directive from above. And in some respects, at first, I was worried by that, and it frightened me, and it created anxiety. But what I've learned to come out of that is that actually that gives us a real opportunity to take control and to manage and to shape what the next stages will look like. And I think as a profession, we've got to make sure that we do that as positively in the best interests of people. I think I've got through that as quickly as I possibly could, Sue.
Excellent. Thanks, Pepe. That was brilliant, and absolutely no need to apologise, because we absolutely need the different perspectives. And as Julie's commented, you know, the structure is what we absolutely need, because that's what we're all struggling with. I think some, you know, in terms of even needing that structure to work around. So, lots of great insights there. And I think you're absolutely right. The opportunity to take some control as we move forward and influence and to use the platform that we have is absolutely essential. So I'll be coming back to you to work with that. Okay, so now I'm going to pass over to our next speaker, who is Warren Karat, who's the CEO of the Nexus Academy Trust. I'm sure he'll introduce himself and hand over. Pepe, if you could just unshare your slides, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, I'm just trying to learn how to do that, Sue.
Yeah, and if I knew how to help you, I would tell you. Dave might jump in and tell. There you go. Sorted. Brilliant. Thanks, Pepe. Okay, Warren, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Sue. I'm assuming people can hear and see me, so I'll keep going. And helpful to follow Pepe, because we've been working really closely over the last few weeks in terms of the big ask of local authorities at a time when, as Pepe said, 10 years after austerity started to bite and the role of the LA changed, they've really had to step up in an unprecedented way. So hopefully what I'll talk through now complements what a lot of the other speakers have said. Both Loic and Pepe talked about some of the pressures on the specialist sector. So I'm not going to focus specifically on what our specific pressures are. And also I think Ian covered a lot of the pressures on individual schools, which I think all our schools, our academies are experiencing. So I don't have slides. What I just wanted to talk through is, I think some of we're feeling for our vulnerable families and the impact that that's going to have now and in the future in terms of what a back to normal model looks like. So just a little bit of context around our Academy Trust. We have 11 academies, 2 in pre-opening, and 8 of the academies that are presently open are special schools spread across South Yorkshire. And I think as a start for 10 for us, a real issue we've had is the contradictory nature of the government's advice for families where they have a child who's got special educational needs and disabilities. So, and that's not a pot shot. I have to say up front that I'll try and remain politically agnostic in my input, but a lot of what the government are doing is making it up as they go along and trying the best, and good people are working hard to do that. So I'm not seeking to criticise, but on the one hand, we still have the statutory responsibility to fulfil the contents of a child's education, health and care plan. And rightly, children with SEND have been designated as vulnerable and needing ongoing support and input from schools. And I wouldn't disagree with that, and we can't argue with the legal position. But at the same time, when the government started upping the ante on vulnerability, on social distancing, individuals with learning difficulties and disabilities were classified as those who would be banded as vulnerable and would need to look at self-isolation. So I think for a lot of our families, there's been this real dilemma. What is the right thing for them to do? And from a trust and a school's perspective, what is the right advice to be given families? Because on the one hand, schools are closed, except for those schools who are meeting the needs of those with the greatest vulnerabilities, and that includes all children with education, health and care plans. Well, for our 8 special academies, that's 100% of our pupil roles. But at the same time, children or adults or people with learning disabilities are more vulnerable potentially to Covid-19 than others, so should be self-isolating. So I think that's been a real dilemma for families, and something which has manifested for us up taking the offer of a place in school, but at the same time, some really struggling with the crisis that's bringing at home, because for a lot of our children and young people, actually school is an essential part of their education, but also I think it's fair to say respite and support for families as well, because some of our children have got very challenging behaviours, and those behaviours become more challenging as their regular routines and systems and processes are taken away from them. So I think that's the first dilemma that we've been dealing with in terms of vulnerability for our children and families. I think the next element is a national issue, which is about the sufficiency of health and care need being reflected in education, health and care plans. Because I think it's fair to say that research done nationally, and I can't cite any immediately, but there's been a lot of publications that have said what we've got is education statements in a different format. And that has been our experience broadly across our special academies. And to be fair, on a day-to-day basis, when business as usual, we'll pick up the health and the additional care needs through the provision that we offer in our schools. But during this period, that's really challenging to do, because our schools aren't health providers. We can't provide health outreach and care outreach. And actually, some of that's against the government guidance. So I think what we've had is real tensions and issues in the system, where a child's statutory entitlement to education, health and care is not necessarily being sufficiently met by partner agencies, who in turn are having to deal with this crisis in their own way. So I think that is a system-wide issue that's not local to Rotherham, Sheffield, South Yorkshire. That's across the country. And I think that will generate a lot of reflections over what is the multi-agency need as reflected in an EHCP, so that in times of crisis, it's provided. Distance learning, I think, is a great tool, and where we have pupils who are more able and academically able to access their learning, they will be picking that up. But we also have a lot of pupils with more severe learning difficulties and highly specialist, where it's just not possible to facilitate that. Particularly our children with profound and multiple learning difficulties, where actually a lot of their education is delivered physically through sensory input. And not being in school where they can get access to that therapeutic sensory input is going to create, and it is creating huge issues for a lot of our pupils. And we've got limited options about how we can bridge that gap in between, because we don't think it's the right thing to be providing outreach and in-reach if families are shielded. It comes back to my first point. So what we know we're going to have to deal with when we get back to the start of the next academic year is potentially a lot of regression for a lot of pupils that is more profound than we'll likely see for mainstream pupils who are accessing some form of learning at home. And we need to wait and see what that will do for children, for our offer, and for families. And I think the final point that I wanted to make is just around the huge challenge on social distancing in all schools. In our mainstream primary school, actually, a lot of our children don't understand that. Colleagues who work in EYFS will know that children just don't, it's not that they don't get it. If they did, it's impossible really for them to comply with. And certainly in our special schools, it's not something that we can adhere to. And again, that's a real challenge, because we can't pretend to be something that we're not. Many colleagues who are part of unions will have received consultation on from the DFE on the reopening of schools. And as we look forward and as we move forward, we need really clear, pragmatic, practically applicable guidance for how we can implement things like social distancing in schools or not. Because whilst ever there's an expectation that we should try, and I understand why there is, I think for the specialist sector with intimate care, with complex pupils who don't understand social distancing and wouldn't, either we have all our workforce in PPE, that's a completely different can of worms, which I'll put the lid on, or we accept that it's not feasible and possible. But if there is guidance that that's what we should be doing, I think we're on a pathway potentially for a lot of industrial action and disagreement with unions, because we could be seen to be not fulfilling our duty care as an employer. So again, I think that the whole notion of social distancing and what's expected, as a specialist sector, we need specialist advice and an understanding of what is and isn't possible. Otherwise, we could find ourselves in a very difficult position where we're either deemed to be insensitive or failing in our duty of care for staff, or not providing appropriate provision for our children who don't understand what's happening right now. And probably worth saying, I think that's a real wicked issue that we're wrestling with, and it isn't just us. But I think that's my input, Sue. That's our view from this part of the sector. I hope that's helpful, and there's nothing too controversial in there. And I think I'm either under time or around about on time.
I think you're around about on time, Warren. So thanks very much for doing that. Yeah, thanks, Warren. As always, you know, I could sit and listen to you all day. And of course, the children and people that you're working with and the staff that work with those very specific needs and challenges. I'm going to take away your phrase, we can't pretend to be something that we're not. And I think that's absolutely, you know, come to the fore. But interesting again to see your reflections on those contradictions between supporting children with those specific needs and challenges, but also shielding them and protecting them as well. And that, yeah, how do you do that? So I'm sure there'll be some follow-up for you from people that are specifically working in that sector. So thanks very much, Warren. I'm sure there'll be a question for you at the end that Sally will be picking up. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to our next speaker now, who is Tom Bannon, who's the CEO of Hoyland Common Academy Trust, and is also the Teaching School Council Sub-Regional Lead for South Yorkshire. So Tom, I will hand over to you. Thanks. Okay, so I'll just introduce you. Tom's just rejoined. Dave, can you have a chat with Tom behind the scenes, and we'll go to Anne and Mandy, and then we'll try and come back to Tom afterwards, if that's okay. So Anne Lowe and Mandy Haddock are early years inclusion officers from Doncaster, so they're going to give their perspective on the work that they've been doing. Okay, over to you.
Thank you. Hi everyone. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you to Warren. I really thought his discussion was very thought-provoking. I work in the specialist provision too, as well as being an early years inclusion officer, and I think it was really interesting. So lots of the presenters today have spoke about strategic and planning. What Anne and I tend to want to do today is just talk about, from a local authority Doncaster point of view, what we are currently doing for children within early years that are deemed as vulnerable and look around inclusion. So I think the biggest challenge that we have is that from an early years sector, we are currently supporting just under 300 children, which out of the 300 children, we've got 190 children due to transition into FS2 in September. So for us, transition is a huge time in children's life. And obviously because of the Covid-19, a lot of the children haven't been attending the current provider. So therefore, how are we supposed to support a transition into the future provider? What we have in Doncaster is for children that don't have an education, health and care plan, we have what we call early intervention allowance. And about 2 years ago, we piloted that funding into maintain schools into FS2 to give schools the opportunity to meet the children, get them in situ with the funding to determine which future support they would need. So around the COVID, what we've done is we've looked to extend that for all children into FS2 so that they'll have funding when they actually go there. So that looks at the resources from a funding point of view. What we want to do now is look at the tools and how we can support the children and do that transition if the child doesn't have the opportunity to do the transition with their previous provider. So we've put in some funding for what we call transition, and if the child was accessing a previous provider, we will fund that provision to do some of the transitional work and the sharing information to upskill. And I don't mean that detrimental, because schools are very knowledgeable and aware, but if you haven't met the child, it's about seeing the practicalities and visually somebody working with that child and using the strategies recommendations. So that's kind of upskilling them and building a link with the child. So that's one of the things we've got in place. The other thing that we've been working very close in partnership with our educational psychologists, and we have set up meetings with the providers and the schools that the children will begin into to do discussions about how we can support them and plan a timescale, obviously linked to the government and the recommendations, so that everybody's aware of the children coming in, and it'll be really clear who's giving that support, whether it'll be the area SENCOs or whether it'll be joined up working with the educational psychologist. So that's the kind of plan that we have for September.
I was just going to say, Andy,
yeah.
I think what we've recognised through this crisis that each individual school and each individual setting is very different in terms of whether they're open at the moment or whether they're closed. Schools obviously are all, there's an expectation that they would be open, but they may be working to a hub approach, and our settings Some of our settings are closed at the moment or maybe reopening. So we have very individual situations dependent on where the child attends, the individual child and setting is experiencing at the moment. So what we've recognised is that a model for that is very bespoke, dependent on the needs of the child.
Yeah, definitely.
Settings move in between. Sorry, Mandy, yeah, if you want to continue.
No, that's fine. So that's how we've kind of looked at the transitional for children with vulnerable children. And I think again it goes back to Warren's point of view about what the government have deemed children as vulnerable. And I think that's been really difficult, particularly, you know, within the provision that I manage. It's very difficult for children to social distance. Parents have got to look at their own moral compass of whether they should send the children or not. But actually, from some of your point of view, children are much safer in the provision, obviously if they've not got medical needs, because of the behaviour and the structure and the routine. So actually, from our point of view, we're finding that the children are in, it's really helping them and helping the balance with their home life. From an early years perspective, one of the things that Anne has said is that we have got just under 90 early years provisions in Doncaster, and at the minute, about 3/4 of them are remaining open. What we do as a local authority support them is we will do weekly phone calls with the providers to see if we can support them with anything. If we can't, then that's signposted to what we call our local solutions group, which is linked into family hubs, CAMS, where we can have a discussion about that child and family, and we've got a real clear strategic plan about how we're going to take that forward and support that. And that includes the safe and well checks for the children that have got early help assessments, or the children the providers have deemed vulnerable but actually might not meet the government's criteria for what they deem as vulnerable. We also have lots of social media on our Facebook for early years providers, childminder providers, so we're linking in with them on a weekly regular basis. Where some of the providers have been struggling around some of their sustainability, we've been looking as an authority to give them a small amount of funding to enable them to sustain their business and keep open to support vulnerable children and children with SEND. So it's I think a lot of people, it's just reiterating what a lot of people have said earlier today, it's about the partnership working with colleagues, particularly health and, you know, our colleagues at CAMS. They've been really supportive in how we can support the family as a whole, and I think that in these times it's just been amazing to see, really. So that's what we're kind of doing as an authority. And the other thing that we're really conscious is that, and I think somebody else has said that, our numbers of children that are now more exposed to domestic violence has increased. So it's looking for ways that can support those vulnerable children in those situations. So we've got lots of plans and things in place for around that then, really. And also, again, looking at the children from a learning point of view, that hopefully schools and the government will take into consideration. There has been some relax on EYFSP data, that actually the expectation when these children go back in, they'll have the opportunity to actually just get their emotional well-being, in the right frame of mind before there's any pressures put on them around things like that. So that's from a Doncaster point of view. I don't know if you want to say anything, Anne.
I think just really picking up on some of the points that other people have talked about during the conference, which has been really useful today. Particularly Rachel, thinking about, I think for us, Rachel mentioned about strengthening that safety net for children, and I think that those aspects is really what we're really keen on trying to implement in Doncaster in terms of the early years team. The way that we're working with providers and childminders and schools is to really try and strengthen that safety net of trying to recognise when the vulnerability of children may increase due to the ongoing scenario of the crisis continuing. So, for instance, a number of our children who weren't attending settings at the beginning of the crisis because parents were able to, or felt they were able to meet needs at home, and that some of that vulnerability now we feel has increased as we've been in touch with families more. So I think for us it's just really important that we have responded on a day-to-day basis as things have changed and anxieties maybe have increased, or possibly things we've been able to put into place have decreased family anxiety. So I think most importantly it's probably that strengthening the safety net, but recognising that it is a changing picture. every week, every day, really, for our families, depending on what they're experiencing and what the needs of the children are. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we.
I think there's only one thing. I think one of the colleagues mentioned it earlier today on the call, is from a school point of view, the director of Doncaster has a weekly phone call with all the heads and thinkers of schools, and in that there is a number of agencies involved in that call. So as if there is any issues around equipment for the pupils to access their home learning or any safeguarding, then it's raised through that phone call, and then it goes into whatever locality, and hopefully a solution is addressed through that. And I think that's been really successful for the schools, because it's good when you chat and keep in contact with people and sharing ideas, and it's good networking to say, oh, our school or academy have done this. So I think that's been a really good network for schools within the authority as well. And as I say, that happens on a weekly basis. So that's been helpful for school providers.
And one of the things I was going to add that I kind of wrote down that I know Julie talked about was she talked about this sense of belonging for children and how we go back to schools and how we support that sense of belonging. So we are really, one of the aspects of our work is looking at that transition to F2 that Amanda has talked about, in terms of how we're trying to support that through the funding that she's allocating to that. And I think we've really had the opportunity to have a bit of a brainstorm together as a team in terms of strategies to support that. But what our next steps are in terms of that, we're keen to hear what other people are doing, to work very closely with the schools and the educational psychologists on what will that look like, and how our school is going to operate with the next guidance that comes into fruition from government guidance. So I think that'll be really, really useful for us to be able to come together as an authority to work in partnership with schools, and which isn't something we've done. Well, we've done some of it before, but we're increasing that offer to Foundation 2, which will be really, I think it'll be a really good opportunity for us to work together and with the early sector across the authority. I think. Is there anything else, Mandy, you wanted to mention?
No, I think that kind of covers everything, really. I think it's just trying to forward plan, but as Anne said, everything changes, on a daily basis, and it's just trying to be prepared and be supportive of the children and the future providers that they're going into.
Yeah, and I think that kind of, a few people talked about it, but Warren talked about, that time scale as well for schools in terms of transitions, what that's going to look like. It's not going to be something, it could look very different with the foundation provision going into year 1, and certainly kind of provision for our children who are moving into Foundation 2, what that will look like. So it's very much a changing picture that we'll have to piece together. I think that's
okay.
Sue, thank you.
That's great, Anne and Mandy. Thank you for that early years perspective from Doncaster, and also transition specifically for children with specific needs is really interesting, and it's something that's generating a lot of conversation. So maybe that's a theme that we want to pick up for future sessions, maybe going forward, in terms of meeting the needs of children with very, very, very specific needs. So yeah, thank you very much, and like I say, do hopefully stay there so we can maybe bring some questions back to you at the end. Okay, so we're going to, Tom is back with us, so we're going to well, I can definitely hear you. There you are, Tom. I can hear you and I can see you, so I think it looks like you're on a different connection.
Well, that's in the right direction, isn't it?
Yeah, okay, so I don't think I need to introduce you again, so I'll hand over to you, and it'll all go swimmingly this time. Okay.
Of course it will. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invite this morning. I think when I was pulling the notes together for this discussion, there were a few phrases that kept coming up. The first two were communication, and the second one, and silos. The one that I've added this morning is generosity, and kind of personal and professional generosity. I think absolutely coming to the forefront during this time. The discussion I've got this morning is about kind of one Borough's approach to how we've managed in this situation. And we're going to give a quick potted history of how the Barnsley Schools Alliance has come together. And Barnsley is an interesting context in itself in terms of deprivation and challenge, but such a mixed economy in terms of academisation, in terms of large multi-academy, small multi-academy trusts, the local authority themselves. With that, we've managed to pull together a sector-led system within the region. So it is schools supporting schools, and the local authority and MATs are just partners within that. There's an elected primary chair, an elected secondary chair, and actually we work together to make sure that we meet the needs of all children in Barnsley. And actually what this has brought up to the forefront is that this sector-led approach has really helped us in readiness for something that we didn't even know was coming. So as it's grown, it's got more teeth and it's got more support, and every child in Barnsley's needs have been met through this. And you can see that in terms of some of the outcomes that Barnsley has had over the last few years, going from absolutely bottom of the pile in terms of local authorities to being above national figures in most of the main measures for the first time last year. So again, is this new? Is it different? No, and I think for me during this time, that communication has been incredibly important. And actually, for the first time in a long time, education's not working in as many silos as it has been. And it could be a point where silos are something that could have come to the fruition. We've all got our own CPD programs, we've all got our own curriculum plans, we've all got our own governor training, and I could go on, but actually this is the point where that generosity and that professional sharing has really kind of come forward. And again, for me, what Barnsley has done well, and people who do know me will be the first to knock kind of local authorities where they've not come together, or MATs where they've not come together. It's something where we really have come together, and I think if there is silver linings to this cloud at the moment, it is that people are coming together and working more generously, sharing more, and meeting the needs of children in a time where it's incredibly difficult. So what have we done as a borough? We've had clear channels of communication, that sharing of best practice, those online in those distance learning resources have all been shared through a single point of communication through the local authority. So again, we're not in that position of reinventing the wheel over and over and over again. We could have been isolated, we could have been working on our own, but actually this professional generosity and the lack of working in silos has meant that the information that's been gathered across the region shows that every single child within Barnsley has had contact from their school. Has had links into social care if needed, has had home learning set, and I don't think I could confidently say that in a normal week every single child in Barnsley is being contacted by their school, but actually in something where we have had challenging times, that has definitely happened. We've all become very used to that kind of Zoom meeting, the online platforms, or not, as the case may be with me this morning. It means that actually we've really kind of come together in ways that have not been normal for everybody, but it's worked really quite well. Those single points of contact, the use of efficient data, the DFE returns that I'm sure we've all loved kind of sending back in for midday every day, actually using them for the benefit of where are the hot spots in the region, where are the cold spots in the region, where do we need that support, where do we need to consolidate as schools and move to hub models, or where is that capacity to take more on, and then moving away from my children or this school's children to a region's children, I think is a really kind of sensible way forward. Having that clear agenda in these meetings, simple. Eden Red have been mentioned once or twice, as you can probably imagine. But again, having that kind of borough-wide strategy that's shared and tiered down, cluster leads have been made aware of it, shared it to their local schools, has meant that we can get information out quickly, and we've probably got more information out quicker in a time of challenge than we have in a time where we're in normal practice. So systems like the use of EWOs, the referrals to social care, the identifying of digitally isolated children have been really efficient. And again, where we are efficient, we can move really quickly. And again, even down to having 7-day-a-week provision, identifying that the school most local to Barnsley District General Hospital is the one that's been under the most pressure. Actually, by using that element of coordination, we've been able to actually open up local schools 7 days a week to meet the needs of key workers that are working in the Barnsley District Hospital. But with that, the element of holding to account, I think it's been there to make sure that everybody does have that strong moral purpose. And I said that sharing, whether it's time, whether it's teaching and learning resources, whether it's finance support, IT support, or even as many secondary schools across the country have been doing at the moment, making and distributing PPE. I think professional generosity has been incredibly positive kind of moving forward. And I think the moving forward bit is the next bit for me. In my teaching school role, it's been interesting to see how the school improvement offer over the last couple of years has been used, and identifying what we called vulnerable schools at that point in time through an Ofsted measure. It's already kind of been muted through DFE, Teaching School Council, in terms of redefining what that vulnerable school is. And I think, let's be honest, school in the country is vulnerable at this time. So again, really redesigning what those support offers will be to school moving forward, from teaching schools, from system leaders, from national leaders, local leaders of governance. But actually the bit that's really come, which is really pleasing for me, is the fact that it isn't the norm of CPD and the norm of support. We're looking at how can we support in terms of well-being, how can we support in terms of bereavement, all the things that presenters earlier in the discussions had. But again, it's this changing landscape. Actually, we need to really look at how do we meet the needs of all children moving forward, whether that's June, whether it's September, and yeah, again, making sure we meet that need now. But one borough's approach is one borough's approach. I don't think we've done anything new or done anything different. But I think one of the things we have done, and we always do quite well in Barnsley, is had a bit of fun around it as well at times. Our assistant director was peer pressured into playing the guitar at the end of one of the sessions. I think the joys of Zoom sessions like this is we always get a little through the keyhole view of people's homes, which raised a nice bit of charity for money for charity for Captain Tom. But I think we have got to laugh at these times, laugh at ourselves and work with our colleagues. And again, for people who know Richard Lynch, a key musician, and we had a lovely rendition of a few Pogue songs from him. So again, I think there is a danger of underestimating the importance of collaboration and fun and enjoyment in a difficult time, because if we're not smiling, we could be crying. Yeah, it's one borough's approach, and I think it's about how we then move forward from here. And what we have learned is that working together, we can have a massive impact, but having an impact on those children that we are serving, communities, in the right way. And I think that's probably about my time too.
Excellent, Tom. Thanks so much for that, to give us an overview of Barnsley's view from there. If we're not laughing, we might be crying. I think we've probably all done a bit of both at various points throughout the current situation. But it's great again to hear I think what you've summed up is what other people have alluded to throughout, is the generosity, both personal and professional generosity of people, and you know, that willingness to pull together and actually break down those walls that have built up over the last few years with changes in education policy. So I think, you know, tying in with what Pepe was saying, really, this gives us a great opportunity to use that going forward in terms of what our asks are and what we need to do. In terms of what education will look like post COVID-19. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sally Pearce now. She's the Early Years Strategic Lead for South Yorkshire Futures. She's a bit of we tend to often come as a double act, so we're bookending this session for now, and then we'll go on to some question and answers. So I'll hand over to Sally for the last speaker.
Okay, thank you very much, Sue. I'm going to be ambitious here and try and share something on my screen to take away the lovely view of my cooker. So just bear with me a moment.
You'd have practiced, Sally, so you can do it. Just no one's watching.
Has it appeared?
No, but it will do any minute now.
I'm going to try again.
There you go, it's coming up now. There you
it's
go.
coming up. Okay, because I can't see it now. So, yeah. Okay. So what I wanted to talk about first of all is some of the work I've been doing with I've had the great pleasure of working with Julie Harmison from Trauma Informed Schools on developing some resources for parents and carers, and also for the children's workforce, to support people through the COVID-19 pandemic. And this came out of talking to our local authority colleagues about what would be helpful at this time. And I was really hoping I could scroll through this document, but I can't, so I'm just going to give you a flavour. So we've been working over the last few weeks to develop 5 sort of infographics. 3 of them are aimed at parents. The first one, which you can see on the screen, part of it now, is some advice for parents on how to talk to children about the coronavirus, picking up a lot of the key messages that Julie had early on about the necessity to be able to talk honestly and openly, but also using that as a vehicle to allay fears. The second one, again, picks up a lot of what Julie was talking about, the power of play, and about how the playing together with your child can be a stress relief both for the child and for the adult, and can also release chemicals and hormones that counter the stress hormones that many of us may be experiencing. The third one is around home learning, and about reassuring parents they don't have to be perfect, and that is a huge challenge to be working yourself at home at the same time as taking responsibility for home learning. And also in that about how playful home learning and joint activities can be a very helpful source of support. The third one is about supporting the children's workforce from the point of view of senior leaders. And the final one is about mental health and well-being. The one you can see in front of you just sort of gives you a flavour of what they look like, but this is sort of been collaborative work to provide infographics. But the most important thing is what sits behind these is a website that we'll be hosting at Sheffield University that has a lot more links and resources on there that we'll be regularly updating. So we're hoping that these will be ready to go out towards the end of the week, that they give clear and reassuring messages to workers and to parents, and also access to more detailed resources and support, specific support, again for both parents and staff. So they've been developed jointly with our local authority partners, and they will be posted up through social media as well as hosted on our site. And so please do get in touch if you would like access to those resources. We'd be very happy to share them as widely as possible with the audience that's here today. Obviously has got that huge interest in how we best support children, families and staff. So that was one of the things I wanted to talk about. But I was also asked just to share, Sue said at the beginning, we're not going to be able today to cover all those vulnerable groups that you have had in here today, or you may be specifically working with. And we do intend to follow up from this session with further sessions on specific areas. But one group that contacted us was Sheffield City of Sanctuary, who are doing a very specific piece of work around providing homeschooling aid for families in South Yorkshire who are in the asylum system. And again, this has come up several times today about the digital divide. And this project has been set up because the children don't have laptops with TVs or even radios and do not have the means to buy them. So the project provides laptops and data. This is particularly critical to some of these children as they're also involved with health and therapeutic services, and the professionals involved are often trying to continue to set up appointments for them, but that the families themselves can't access them. And we felt that we wanted to share this because sort of refugees and asylum seekers have not really been covered fully in the conference. But that City of Sanctuary, and I know there's probably somebody from here in the audience from City of Sanctuary who may be able to share their details through the chat. I think that's all I was going to say, Sue. That's okay, because I think I need to go back into my other role now of also organising the questions. She's nodding to me, questions to speakers.
Please.
Okay, and we'll work out how to share those resources. I can see the chat whizzing in front of me here, asking how we're going to share them. We're just finalising them over the next 2 days, probably, just final tweaks to wording and illustrations and the website links, the URLs. So we will we'll make sure that goes out to everybody who's signed up to the conference for you to share with your parents, families and workers.
Okay, just while I give Sally a moment to catch her breath and think about what she's going to say next. We are obviously trying to keep track of the chat. We have recorded it, so any specific requests on there, we will try to follow up in some form or another. And like I say, there'll be opportunities for people that are in the audience that have things to share to send those in as well, and we'll try and think about how other links and resources might want to share. But yeah, Sally's and colleagues have been working incredibly hard behind the scenes to get those resources up and ready, and we're itching to get them out. And it's not for lack of trying, but they'll be there imminently. So Sally, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So thinking back to the first speaker at the session was Pepe, and we had a specific question around: have local authorities considered how detached youth work could offer support to older young people to strengthen the safety net? And that came from Karen Chalice.
Yes, we're currently in negotiations with colleagues who both work at RNN, but also with our early help team where the youth workers are now based, so that we can reach more students and have greater contact with more students. So that is something that is certainly on a Rotherham plan at the moment. One of the things I didn't say in my presentation was that we're linking very closely with ADCS colleagues across the north of England as well, and that will be shared with them too. So that is something that's being shared. I also noticed this morning at the select committee that there's a lot of talk about summer schools and engaging the NCA to spread what were smaller ideas around summer activities and summer schools from previous years, and using those to help what will be a narrowing a gap agenda, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if Warren will want to come back on this one. It's really your can of worms. I'm afraid you couldn't keep the lid on, because what you talked about sort of spark for people in the audience, particularly those, we've got people who are working in nurseries, are obviously involved in caring for very young children and babies and intimate care. So questions about how do we maintain any kind of social distancing in those circumstances. And also questions from people who are having one-to-one sessions with children with special educational needs, who have a close physical relationship that they cannot emotionally withdraw from. How can we manage that situation both for staff and children? And I think, Warren, you already said that you didn't have any answers to that. I don't know, Pepe, you're still on my screen, whether you have any ideas on that.
In all honesty, no, I don't have answers for that, because I believe that every single child will have a different context and a different situation. And what I would say is that we are managing every day the tensions between safety and well-being against the tensions around the safeguarding and educational health and support for any individual child and their family. And in my opinion, nothing tops the health and well-being of both staff, teachers, early years practitioners over the top of an educational directive or something of that way. So for me, that's the first thing that we should consider in that difficult balancing situation. Warren may have a view.
Yeah, I think like Pepe, echo what Pepe said, and will not make an effort to give any advice. I can just say about what we've done so far to deal with that real wicked issue, which is we've been able to sustain provision where it's been needed by staff who've been willing and voluntarily able to do that. And I think as we start to move towards schools reopening and what that process will look like, that's where I think the plea from me, and hopefully from this group, and I think probably from everybody, is we just need really clear advice on what we do then that's rooted in reality and that can be pragmatically and practically applied, because we may reach a point where we don't have the people who are willing to volunteer to do that, where families are sending children in, and like Pepe, and that's probably like any senior leader, any person who's managing people, it's really difficult now to feel that we can just direct people to do something that, when they're scared, when they're worried, when they've got their own families. and that puts us all in an impossible position. So the next phase of guidance that comes with the reopening of schools, however that looks, whatever it's like, has got to understand the specifics of those schools' context and not set false expectations. So if the expectation is we still socially distant, then we have to be really real. We're not opening schools in the way that parents might think we are. If social distancing is being dispensed because that's the scientific advice and it's safe to do that, then we need to be really clear that that's the scientific advice and it's safe to do that. But leaving that as a local decision for an individual school is just going to, well, that kind of worms will continue to seep out all over everybody, and we'll find ourselves with more worried families, more worried staff, more worried children, and more dispute because there isn't a way to win from that discourse. So that is probably a helpful sidestep in terms of advice. But I think the only thing that we're doing as a trust, above and beyond everything else, is looking at what the government advice gives us. And right now, that's had enough flexibility in it to allow us to continue to sustain an offer with volunteers. So continuing to do discharge our duty of care in a way that, well, our staff are telling us is meeting their needs.
Okay, thank you very much, Ryan. I think it's probably a bit linked to what you were just talking about there, because there was a thread coming through about parents who don't feel it's safe to send their children back to school, perhaps because of those confusions in advice. And how will schools and local authorities deal with that issue?
What I would say is that I received last night information from the DfE who are looking at changes to behaviour and discipline codes of conduct and rules that are currently in statute. So I know that there is thinking at the highest level at what sanctions can be applied going forward. So I don't think that the government are working against us here. I think that what they want is for school leaders to work in partnership with their communities. And if parents don't think it's safe to send their students or their young people or their children to school, then they shouldn't send them to school. And if my school are looking at opening to year 12 in the future or year 10 in the future, and a year 10 mother says, I don't want my child to come, then they won't come to school, will they? And we won't be bringing them up and saying, you've got a cause for concern, Mark, or you've got a negative grade, or that will count against you, because nothing trumps health and well-being, and nothing trumps working together with your community and building those relationships. I've got this vision for the worst possible case scenario of traumatized young people returning to school and being met by teachers in full PPE gear with visors and masks on, and that is not going to sort out anything or resolve anything, and we cannot have that. So when it's safe and when we've met the 5 criteria that have been shared, then we can start to look at what is appropriate and how it's appropriate. And I'd say from everything I've heard from the DfE and the RSC in this region, they are working with us to make that right and for that to be as flexible, as contextualized as we need it to be. And we just need to take control of that agenda.
Thank you very much. There's a couple of questions around early years, if Mandy and Anne are still available. The first one is that we're due for some major changes to the early years foundation stage in terms of baseline assessments and the introduction of changes to early learning goals. How is it envisaged that local authorities will manage that alongside transition?
Difficult one. I suppose, we are all on the edge of our seats and waiting to hear about the new changes to the EYFS and the FSP, and how that's going to affect us in terms of our work with early years providers and schools. And I think one of the things that we need to be really mindful of is that it is a very changing picture at the moment. So as I said earlier, I suppose it's really thinking about the priorities of what we can do and when we can do it, and strengthening those links between the providers and the schools, and really working towards that really good communication, so that the providers and schools work together to deliver the EYFS or the future EYFS, if you like. So we've been working with our team very closely to try and develop those relationships between schools and providers. And so what we hope is with a really good platform for good communication and a good platform for the foundations of the earliest foundation stage. Any changes will be easier to implement, but it is a changing picture, as we all know. So any ideas would be really useful.
Well, you've done an amazing job because you've answered my next question, which was going to be how are you going to build stronger partnerships between the private and voluntary sector and schools? I mean, that was around supporting the transition for children.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've spoken a lot about. We've gone back in terms of our team of area Senkos. We've gone back to looking at kind of what the core values are about good transitions. So revisiting some of those core things around partnership work and parents and families feeling really confident and happy and really understanding the process of transition. And I think going back to those core values really helps us to look at how we can improve the ways that we're going to move forward with supporting children to have that seamless transition. It's going to look very, very different to what we've had previously because of the crisis. And generally we've had very positive views, but I think it is a learning curve for all of us, and hopefully a really good opportunities for private providers and schools to work even more closely together. I don't know if Mandy wants to add to that, if she's still on there. Are you still here, Mandy?
Maybe not. That's fine. Thank you very much, Anne. So I may have to hand over to Sue at this point, because as I was speaking, there's probably some of the questions that I missed. I was really intrigued to know which folk songs were being sung in Barnsley, but I don't think anybody's asked that one, although they did comment on it. So Sue, is there anything else, any other questions that you picked up while I was speaking?
No, I don't think so. So I think they were around about the same things that you've been talking about, but I think probably now is a good time to start to wrap up. There are obviously lots of questions that have come through on the chat, and we've got the task now of trying to pull all that together. I just want to say a few things before we finish. But first of all, it's been a massive challenge in my ability to multitask this morning, so I apologise if I haven't grasped everything as we've gone through it. But what's come through really strongly is the huge generosity of appetite to cooperate and to work together, and, you know, as a couple of speakers have said, break down some of those walls and really do what teachers and educators do best, is roll the sleeves up, you know, get their heads down and get on with it and pull together. So that's come through in bucket loads, both in terms of what the speakers have been saying, but also in terms of the conversations that have been taking place through the chat system. There do seem to be a lot of calls to do something like this going forward, when we're in the new normal, as we keep saying, and we'll certainly look to do that. I think what's been really interesting is the conversation around the definitions now of vulnerable children and vulnerable schools. And I think, again, that's something that we can take forward, but particularly this position that we're now in to challenge what was normal as we go into the next phase of transition and recovery, and use the voice that we have to ask those difficult questions and to make the demands that we need to make on behalf of our children and young people. So do please take up the invites to get involved in anything that you do see coming forward, please. The final thing I want to say really is a thanks to the speakers. They're all very humble people that have given up their time. As you know, there's been no cost putting on this event, of course, this morning, and they've given up their time and expertise without question, and have put their hands up and got involved. So I want to say a huge thanks for putting themselves under the pressure, not just of speaking, because they're mostly used to that, but speaking in this sort of format, which is, you know, not the easiest thing to do. So a really heartfelt thanks to all the speakers this morning, and absolutely everybody who's contributed, either as an audience member, whether they've contributed to the chat or sat and listened, and hopefully will take things forward. Please do fill the feedback forms in and the request for more information as they come out to you. But I'm going to do what I always try and do, is wrap up a couple of minutes before the finish time and say, again, thank you to everyone. Do watch this space. This is obviously just part of the conversation that we take forward. If any of the speakers want to just stay online at the end, if they want to have a quick chat, that's great. But I'll say goodbye, and people can log off now and move away from the conference. Thank you very much.